Hey there, it's Nathan Hartman. Before we get into today's episode, I'd just like to take a moment and thank all of you for tuning in. It's been a couple months now that we've been at this, and the response has been more than I could have hoped. Fans of the podcast have reached out and said, hey, even when I don't know who the guest is coming in, I leave the episode wanting to know what they're up to creatively. And for me, that accomplishes what I've set out to do, bring Disney fans closer together. If you feel this podcast has helped you do that, please throw us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcast and share a link to us with your other Disney fan friends. It means a heck of a lot to me. And look, I know it's super easy to forget to do these things. You're listening to this podcast and you're going to listen to somebody else's or whatever. So we're just going to take a moment here. And if you're not driving, so if you're driving, pull over to the side of the road or, just whatever you can do. But everyone else, put those dishes down or, stop the vacuum for a second or whatever, and just give me that moment. Just go ahead and give me that 5-star or that, share that link or whatever. So there you go. I'm going to give you a moment to do it. Ready? Here you go. Go. Okay. You did it. You're the best. I couldn't have asked for better listeners. All right. So here you go. Here's this week's show.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls.
Place all loose items in the pouch in front of you.
Have a safe and informative journey.
Hello, I'm Nathan Hartman, and this is Dreamfinders, a podcast about the creative culture of Disney theme parks. Jason Lethcoe's career began with a mistake. He had applied to take a skills test with animation legend Don Bluth's company, but he'd been rejected. Fate, though, had other plans. Somebody grabbed his name from the wrong folder, and suddenly he was given a shot. Not long after that, he found himself working on The Little Mermaid at the birth of the Disney animation renaissance, as well as creating his own stories as an author of young adult fiction. Jason chats with me about his time at Disney working on an animated Pirates of the Caribbean movie that never saw the light of day, what it was like to have his book Zoom's Academy turned into a feature film, and how he got the chance to read a portion of Ray Bradbury to Ray Bradbury. All of that and more is coming right up on Dreamfinders. Jason Lethcoe, welcome to Dreamfinders.
Hi, thanks. Glad to be here.
So your adventures with telling stories have had you all over the place, everywhere from writing children's novels to drawing comic books to working both on the small and big screen. But before we get into all of that, were you interested in multiple forms of creativity as a kid?
I was one of those kids. I was either out in the garage building wings for my 10-speed and trying to impress a girl across the street. Didn't work, but I was doing everything I could think of to be creative, and drawing was a sort of secondary part of that process for me. I loved stories. I was an avid reader, so I think books were my source. And everything sprung off from there, from, building forts and costumes and anything you could think of. I wanted to make my own theme park. And I actually built a version of Pirates of the Caribbean in my garage when I was about 15 and managed to get the fireflies and, a swamp going. And, I was really just all in on all that stuff.
So clearly you had a love for the Disney theme parks at an early age. Where did you grow up?
Well, I was born in Portland, Oregon, but one of my favorite earliest memories was being in first grade, and my parents showed up unannounced and said, "We're going to Disneyland." And at that time, it seemed like a far off place, and I was so excited. Of course, hearing all the kids moaning and groaning and saying lucky and all that only added to the thrill. And when I went down there at about 6 years old, I was forever changed. That's the only way to put it. I experienced something there that I'd never seen or had before. And I think it's what kind of drove me towards wanting to work for Disney eventually, because it was truly magic.
Is there any, I love asking this question of people because it's so varied, but do you have any sort of memories of that first trip, specific things that stick out to you that was impactful?
Yeah, absolutely. This would have been about 1976, or no, let's see, I was born in 67, 72, 73. So the park was still rudimentary compared to what it is today in some ways, but it was charming in others. And they had a lot of hands-on sorts of arts and crafts. And I remember the glass blower on Main Street really vividly, and watching him create all kinds of different sculptures, and buying a glass piano for my first grade teacher and being so proud to bring this little hand-blown glass thing back from this faraway exotic place in California. And of course, the park itself, it was so influenced by that 1950s Mary Blair kind of style at that time that, the art direction and everything else, it really did feel like you were stepping into another world.
Beyond Disney, which clearly has a connection with your early creative adventure, what sort of other creative influences inspired your stories and what you wanted to tell?
Well, I guess there were a few big touchstones, and I would have to say Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, when it came out in the 70s, this idea, I think, of a world beyond your doorstep, something that if you were chosen, you could enter, was a big part of my, creative spark. The Narnia books, all those books that had to deal with, and even in the 80s when Time Bandits came out, the sense that a portal could open right in front of your eyes and you didn't know it was there, and you could pop through it and you'd be in a completely other fantastical world that's right under your nose. I think that was those were some big sources for me.
So what, in the end, of course, you had to sort of grow up and choose a path of some sort. How did that end up becoming animation and going to Moore Park College?
It's kind of interesting because pre-internet, it was very difficult to even conceive of a career in animation without even knowing where to begin. My parents happened to relocate to California. And, of course, my first thought when they relocated was, how soon am I going to go to Disneyland? It was the first thing in my mind was, I got to get down there again, because it had been a few years and now I was in high school. And I had been planning on getting into film. I had been writing scripts, and I had my, little Super 8 cameras, was making little films, and yet I had no idea how to get into Hollywood. In fact, I remember driving, kids don't do this at home, but I drove down to Universal Studios and I somehow managed to fake my way through the guard gate, got to the mail room and an interoffice envelope, and addressed it to Steven Spielberg. And I'd had a pre-written note that said, I'm your next big, your next big potential director. I don't know how often he gets those, but I went to the mailroom and I gave it to them. I said, this needs to get to Mr. Spielberg right away. And they're like, wait, who are you? And I kind of got out of there as fast as I could. But I didn't know how to break in. And I'd loved animation. I'd loved cartoons. There was an old book called How to Draw Cartoons by Preston Blair, I think. And it was just, old school animation, 2D. And one day I was looking in the phone book and I saw there was a place out where I lived where a guy taught kids 2D animation. And I said, well, I'll take anything. And so I started learning kind of through someone who worked in the business how to do basic in-betweening, which is drawing the in-betweens between two poses for 2D animation. And ended up taking a test for Don Bluth, who did All Dogs Go to Heaven back then, really old film. And I managed to pass the test. Actually, if you really want the dirt on that, I had taken the test because my name had accidentally been put in a file that said, give this guy a test. I was supposed to be in the reject file, but they put me in the give this kid a test file. I did it, and I got a call from one of the studio's directors who said, I don't know where you went to school, but you're a natural. Why don't you come in and, start working on this project? And that was the way I got into animation, and 30 years later, still doing it. So,
how soon after college were you at Disney? Because it seemed like a really quick jump.
It was pretty quick. I just really took a couple years of college. It was, I was probably, let's see. Let's go back to the film. That's how I probably remember. My first Disney project would have been, this is how it went. I went to Bluth I got in there first, and then I got a job in betweening on Tummy Trouble, a Roger Rabbit short.
Oh, yes.
Then I went over and worked at Imagineering for a little while, helping to refurbish props for the backlot tour in Florida. And after that, I think it was when I went over to Little Mermaid. I may have my timeline screwed up there, but it's something like that, because I went over to Little Mermaid working as an in-betweener, and that was my first Disney feature, and that was really exciting. And after that, the bug was, firmly in me to try to make my way through that company and make stuff that was, I guess, my nostalgic childhood. I wanted to kind of do an homage to it in one way or another. And so I ended up getting an opportunity to work on several films and worked my way up into the story department and attempted to do Disneyland themed things from the very first chance I got. And the first thing I was offered an opportunity to try and direct was Disney's Pirates of the Caribbean, which was going to be animated. It was going to be a direct-to-video animated thing, and we got into that. And we just really had a ball and took it to their guy, and he took it. And I think some conversation must have happened that said maybe this would be better as a live-action thing. So that one didn't work. I had another opportunity to be the head of story on a Haunted Mansion project that was in development. That one didn't end up going. So finally, I turned my sights to Disney Publishing and said, look, I've got to write something about my love for Disneyland. And that's when I was able to get the Tales from Adventureland series.
And you have quite the. I was just trying to think through it. I think you're correct that Hollywood Studios opened in '89, which is sort of the same time as Little Mermaid. So it all sort of comes together in that sort of way.
Memories get foggy now.
Right, sure. Do you remember? If for those who have seen the documentary Waking Sleeping Beauty, which is about the resurgence of Disney animation in the 90s. Did you have that experience coming in on Little Mermaid? Did you have that feeling that animation at Disney was trying to push who they were known as at that moment?
It was, yeah. I mean, it was pretty exciting because prior to that, the films had just been, a little under the radar. I mean, I thought The Great Mouse Detective was a really neat film. I wasn't there for it. I had gotten to tour the studio through a friend, and I'd gotten to see a few of the storyboards for it. And I thought, wow, that's going to be a neat film. But when Little Mermaid was underway, there was something about going into those sweatbox dailies and seeing the animation. And it was like electricity. There was some feeling that you went, gosh, this is like a return to what they used to do around here. This is like Cinderella. It's like Sleeping Beauty. It was our version of it. And technically speaking, of course, I think it's nowhere close to what those masterful guys were doing, but it was the beginning. And you sensed it was a new beginning for the studio. And I still have my little note from Roy Disney that I keep on my wall where he sent out these notes to all the people that worked on it and said that he just wanted to say how pleased he was with it and felt that there was more to come and the best was yet to come. I think he was right.
For a lot of your time at not only at Disney but at other places as well, Sony and many others, you work as a story artist. And for those who don't know, I'm just curious if you'd give us a little description of what that's like.
Sure. Well, I've had this unique opportunity to work in a lot of different positions, and I started in animation and worked my way up to being an animator. And I animated on a film called The Page Master. I was an animator for Warner Brothers for a lot of the Bugs Bunny stuff for quite a while. But as 2D was starting to give way to computers, I started playing with the idea of story, and it was almost accidental. I was an animation supervisor on a project, and the director said, "Hey, we need some help in storyboards. Have you ever done it before?" I said, "No, but it looks fun." And I think I just sat down and started boarding, and it felt so natural and easy. I said, how about this? He said, wow, this is great. You haven't done this before. I said, no, it felt really natural. And in some ways, even more natural than animating. It just was easy to tell a story with pictures, almost like a comic book version. And you were given at that time, things are a lot more script driven now, but back then they would give you just a little moment. Like say, we have a moment in the film where, boy meets girl and something terrible goes wrong. There's a incident with a tractor. I don't know, I'm just making up. So you just sit there and you brainstorm, and then you go away and you just invent what you think that dialogue and that story moment might be like. And when you got to do things like that as a story artist, it was really gratifying because you were writing as well. And so that's what became really addictive for me.
I think it's sort of interesting, and of course you've done a lot of stuff. There is this sort of arc, one could say, in doing story work for Disney or animation work, that you go from Little Mermaid, and it seems, correct me if I'm wrong, of course, that you did one of your last projects was doing some story work for Home on the Range. Is that correct?
I did. That was actually the most recent thing I was working on was over on Disney's Jets, which was unfortunately Disney Toons shut down recently. But Home on the Range was one of the last features I did story work on. After that, a lot of the other stuff has been in development.
Yeah, yeah. And for those who don't have a great idea about what development means, it's basically that massive process of getting paychecks for things people don't see.
Exactly.
Yeah. And
it's often a lot of things that don't make it off the launch pad that have tremendous potential. But timing, it's almost amazing. Anything gets made. The older I get, I look at that and I go, wow, all the planets need to align on a project. And when they do and they work, boy, it's amazing. It's like a magic trick. But up until that point, you can play around with all kinds of ideas for many years, and some of them won't see the light of day.
What I think is interesting, of course, because you mentioned your work with Toon Disney as well, is you sort of saw both at the end of Home on the Range them sort of pull back in traditional animation for a time, and then of course Toon Disney has been sort of closed, merged, all sorts of different ways of sort of putting it logistically. Do you think Disney as a creative culture, are they good at sort of seeing where the trends go and matching them? And of course this means sort of shifts in where people go, but how good are they at sort of seeing what is to come opposed to where they're currently at?
Well, that's a big question. I would say that they can be the best at it sometimes because Little Mermaid was certainly the beginning of an era for them. And I think they saw what other people were doing. They said, let's go back to what we do best. And it was that fairy tale princess movie. And to get that new music at the time was a big step forward as well. Mm. So they're really good at recognizing talent. They're really, really good about getting a sense of the culture, and they're pretty responsible generally in terms of the projects they choose and wanting them to say something positive. And so with those three ingredients, they do pretty well. If there was a forecast, they do pretty well about picking things that they know will resonate with whatever demographic they're aiming for.
So at what point in your career did you decide that you were, or maybe you were always interested in writing for children? When did that kind of come about where you wanted to, you mentioned wanting to write the Adventureland series, but of course we'll talk about some of your other series as well. When did you first sort of think, you know what, I not only want to write, but I'm interested in this specific demographic?
Well, it happened for me. I was working on the Snow Queen, which was prior to Frozen. We were doing the Snow Queen over there at Disney, and I was working on the boards, and it was coming along, and I was, thinking to myself at that time, comic books, doing independent comic books was still something that was fairly new. Most people at that time thought if you had to do a comic book, it had to come through Marvel or something like that. So I had done a comic book, and it was called Zoom's Academy. And I'd written it as a comic, but I realized that, the comic book medium didn't go as far as I'd wanted to go with the writing. And I thought, what if I took this same idea and I wrote it as a book? And it was sort of a love letter for my oldest daughter at the time. And I thought, something nice for her. This is just a little father-daughter story. Let me see if I can tell a good one. And that's when it started. And I was lucky enough to, after writing that, find a publisher. And then it got made into the movie with Tim Allen, Zoom, in 2006, I think, which is a little different from the book, but it was still cool to have that happen.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. I'm curious, after spending so much time working on transforming stories into film projects and being in development, what was it like being on the other side of that coin, having your own work adapted?
Wow. It stung a little at first, because when you're that close and personal with a book, you're investing so many hours in developing those characters in your mind that your initial shock is, well, wow, they're changing it quite a bit. But then one of the great parts of having worked as part of this process on the other side was to understand that a book and a film are two very different things. And so you have to let one go often to become something else. And you can respect them for what they are. They're different, but they can still come from the same source. And that's just fine. So it prepared me to probably have a little more of a easier transition than many authors that haven't worked in Hollywood might have when their work is changed. So I was able to accept those changes and then look at it through a different lens and go, oh, okay, I wouldn't have thought of that, but that's fun.
What sort of authors inspire you?
Well, my early days were some of the classics, with the Tolkiens and the Lewises and that sort of thing. But, as I got older, I think some of the authors that really transcended for me were some of the surrealist authors, like Jonathan Carroll. He writes some incredible fiction that takes you places you would never expect to go. Neil Gaiman, of course, his work is always fascinating. And so I really look for those fantasies that take you to new worlds. And so it inspires me to build worlds of my own.
You have this excellent story about meeting one of your favorite authors, Ray Bradbury, and I was wondering if you would tell us that story, because it's really really wonderful.
Well, Ray Bradbury, if I go back, to high school especially, was one of the authors I admired, but knew it's almost like looking at someone that you go, wow, this guy's a poet of the highest order. I don't know that I could ever tell a story like he could, but his words were just so beautiful. And so I would read his stories religiously. And after, I found out living in a town called Thousand Oaks, he would frequent the Thousand Oaks Library from time to time. And for whatever reason, I always just missed him. And one day, a friend of mine I was working with, he came up in a topic, and I thought, well, he's a master. And he was such an influence that my friend said, yeah, I know him. I said, you do? He said, yeah. He said, yeah, he's not doing well. He's getting towards the end there, but if you'd like to meet him, I could check it. And of course, I couldn't even believe that. I just thought, really, this is even going to happen? I mean, so many near misses. And so I was thrilled when we got to go over to his house, and there he was. And it was the most wonderfully intimate moment with this guy who had, done so much and been so great. And even someone that had worked with Walt Disney, and to sit by his bedside. And I had brought my old battered copy from high school of one of his collections, and he looked at it and he said, "Oh, that's a good one." I said, I think so, and he said, why don't you, could you read me the preface in that book? And it was about a 10-page preface. And he just wanted to hold my hand. It felt like I was with my grandpa almost, And he just wanted me to hold my hand while I read him that preface to that book. And that preface covered his life story. And it just talked about his beginnings and how he came up with the stories, some of his, inspiration. And it was almost like getting to live through a timeline with him in that moment that encompassed his life. And from time to time, he would just speak of him and go, oh, yes, I remember that, and elaborate on something here or there. It was like we got to go through a time machine together for a very brief moment. And it was one of the most special events in my life.
Tell us a little bit about your first series after Zoom, the Misadventures of Benjamin Bartholomew Piff. What sort of inspired that story, and tell us a little bit about it.
I had adopted my son, and there was, of course, I find that a lot of stories come from your real life in different ways. And this one was like, well, what is this process about a kid who needs a father? And in this story, a father who didn't think that he could ever be a great father. And when they find each other, it fulfills this kid's greatest wish, but it isn't the wish that he wishes for initially. He wishes for unlimited wishes. And when the factory that fulfills them is almost brought to their knees, finally they bring him up there to the Wishworks factory. And it's like, okay, kid, first of all, look at all the damage you've caused. All these other people don't have birthday wishes coming true because you took them all. And secondly, we have this other rival factory called Curseworks that is out to destroy everything we do. So, you need to help us out. And through that, these two bond and find each other, and the kid ultimately finds a new dad. So it was a really heartfelt story, but also magical.
You follow this, of course, with the Mysterious Mr. Spine series, which is sort of supernatural in dealing with concepts like the afterlife and death. What's your ethos about addressing deeper subjects with kids in your writing?
I try to look to guides, people that have probably done better than I at relating with kids, like Mr. Rogers. Fred Rogers was such a big part of my childhood, and I noted that he would never shy away from difficult topics, and you always have to approach them very carefully. At the same time, I wanted to create in writing about the afterlife, I wanted to show a version of it that was filled with excitement and adventure, and most of all, redemption. And in that story, it basically has to do with a kid who was born from a father he never met, who turned out to be a fallen angel. And when he sprouts wings, he doesn't know what to do with them. And he's always had a terrible stutter. And of course, once his father comes back into his life and ushers him into the afterlife to locate his mother, who is having trouble up there. These are deep topics, but the bonding between this kid and his father, again, as they go through it, helps the kid discover his own voice and how to sing. And ultimately, in finding the father and mother are reunited and able to move on, and then the kid can then be strong and fulfill his destiny. So the afterlife, as I point out in the beginning of the book, is a fictional version that I've come up with that isn't necessarily supposed to argue with anyone's spiritual beliefs, but it is a what if question. What if it was like this? And more importantly, will love be the most determining factor in the afterlife, the most valuable asset? And can that transcend everything? And so that's what I kind of centered on.
Now, your next series couldn't be more different, I don't think, from the previous one, which, of course, authors love to do after sort of living in a certain pool of tone for a while, which is No Place Like Holmes, which follows a detective and his nephew who solve mysteries, but they live at 21A Baker instead of 21B. Were you a big Conan Doyle fan as a kid, or when did you get into, or, what sort of inspired this tale?
Well, thanks for asking that, actually. I had a really deep love for those stories, read them back and forth, through my childhood and high school, and always admired that incredibly logical brain that Sherlock Holmes had, and how he could come to that conclusion, and it was almost supernatural. And I found myself, actually, when I wrote that book, thinking about success stories of people that had almost like good fortune combined with their amazing talent, opening up these incredible vistas. And I thought about, what's it like to be the next door neighbor? Because I can relate to him a little more. I'm no J.K. Rowling. I write my books and I put my whole heart into them, and I hope they'll find the audience that I intend for them. But then you look at someone like J.K. Rowling with Harry Potter, and you're like, wow, selling all those books must be incredible. So feeling a little bit like a next door neighbor myself, I decided, who is this guy that lived on Baker Street before Holmes ever moved in and was a detective? And then when this guy moves in at the next door and suddenly solving cases right and left, publicity everywhere. I mean, reporters, and he's been trying to solve those same crimes and was almost there. I mean, it's like he's one clue short. If he had just put that one thing together, he would have beat him to it, and he never has. So as he lives in this constant state of competition, resentment, why isn't it not me? Those feelings. In comes his little nephew into his life, who is actually the brilliant counterpart that was needed, but is coming at this problem not in terms of let's make you feel validated by beating Sherlock Holmes. It's make you feel validated by having a family that you had long forgotten because you were so obsessed with your own success. So this nephew becomes a very important person in his life to show, wait a minute, all that stuff doesn't matter. It's about the people you love around you that really make you a success story. And of course, they go on to work together to solve unique cases. And Holmes eventually looks to them and says, there's some cases I can't take. Would you guys mind? And they're like, no problem. So that was a fun series.
So you just recently released your third book in the Tales from Adventureland series from Disney Publishing. How did this whole concept come about?
Well, again, with the idea of telling stories about families, I think that's a big part of my writing somehow. And this one had to do with, again, I identified as a kid as feeling like I was an avid reader. I had a big fantasy world inside of me. I didn't feel that like I related that well to what the other kids were about. And I know that feeling of isolation. And I thought about this kid who's, read about adventures, but never been on one, until his grandfather, basically going to his grandfather's funeral, a grandfather he's never met, comes to find out that his grandfather left him an inheritance that, upon opening it, leads him to find that his grandfather not only isn't dead, but is now a living, breathing, shrunken head. and has adventures for him to start participating in. So this kid goes through an incredible journey of finding out what he's capable of by having someone believe in him, a mentor figure, a grandfather, like a father, grandfather, someone that can see in you all that you can do, and then picks you up and says, no, you can do this. You are stronger than you think. You're more clever than you think. And I think you've got some of me in you. And if I can do these things, you can do it. I think we all need to hear that sometimes.
So, as we've talked about in your career, you've had an opportunity to sort of develop for Pirates. You've developed for Haunted Mansion, and of course now you're working in Adventureland. What is the process of thinking through making stories for attractions or lands? Is that any different than taking adapting a book or anything of that nature? What's the difference with the source material?
Well, it's very different because, first of all, you approach it with both excitement and then what have I done? Because now I'm tampering with someone's idea of this wonderful place. And so it's a huge responsibility, if you truly love it, to want to do it the very best way you know how. And though you'll never please everyone, Disney's pretty good about making sure that whatever you write is vetted through the entire company. And so what you write has to be go through publishing and go through the attractions and really be seen by everyone before they'll sign off on it. So they don't let you go too far astray if you're, putting something in there that wouldn't be okay. But at the other hand, the real thrill for me was Adventureland had always been my favorite part of Disneyland. And, back in the 80s when I would go with my friends in high school, there were like little things there. They had this Tahitian terrace where, they would have Polynesian dancers. And then, of course, the jungle bar over there before it was the Bengal barbecue had like these great, I don't know why these were so good, but it was like a buttermilk glazed donut, kind of a orange flavor to it, and a jungle julep. And it was like, that was the thing. I would go to Disneyland, go straight there, make sure I booked the Tahitian Terrace for dinner and ride the jungle cruise. And it was just a place where I felt like I wish I could stay here. And so in going there later as a, older person and an adult, I went and I looked around and I thought, is there more to this place than meets the eye? And so I started studying all the nooks and crannies. Even you'll notice in Adventureland, there's crates with names on them. And you look on what they've done to the Jungle Cruise and added, those little vignettes where you see desks and people and you hear the voice of the jungle on the radio. And you're like, well, who are these people? So I really opened my eyes and ears and all my senses and decided, can I make something out of this that is a little bit bigger and more mysterious, and that, like the other things I've written, if you knew where to look, you could walk through a magic portal and see far more to Adventureland than you ever thought possible.
Is there any connection with your series? And you don't say it by name, but tonally, there seems like a little bit of a connection with Disney's Society of Explorers and Adventurers, SEA. Did that have impact as well on how you thought through the writing of the books?
Yeah, definitely, because I was lucky enough to be part of a secret society back 2005. We a group called the Brotherhood of Thaumaturgic Cartographers. And basically the idea was to take a group and explore all the things that you've ever seen as supernatural or scary and see them for yourself. So we went to a haunted hotel. We went to a time-traveling machine that was supposedly real. We also went to the first alchemist convention in 500 years. We hunted for Yeti and Sasquatch. I mean, we've done all kinds of things. So when I found out about the SEA organization, I went, well, gosh, I like that. And they said, well, you can like it, but we have other plans for it. If you want to use an organization in your book, you'll need to come up with one of your own. I said, okay, you got it. So the Jungle Explorers Society was founded in the Adventureland series, which has both striking similarities to the SEA organization, but also has some unique things about it that are all its own.
So finishing up here, one final question for you. If there was one more theme park land that Disney would let you write about, what would it be?
Well, it's interesting you ask because I proposed a couple things. And I don't even know if I can say them, but let me just put it this way. The parts of Disneyland that have inspired me the most have to do with the heritage attractions, but that there might be a lot more to them than meets the eye. And the new series I'm about to write for them is going to be maybe, and it's hard for me to say this because I enjoyed Adventureland so much, but maybe even more exciting. I am so thrilled to sit down and begin writing this that can't wait to share that when it comes out.
Well, we're waiting on pins and needles for that, and we'll have to catch up with you once that's written. Jason Lethcoe, thank you so much for coming on Dreamfinders. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you.
And that's it for this episode of Dreamfinders. Thanks to Jason Lethcoe for coming on and being my guest. You can purchase all his work on Amazon, including his newest tale from Adventureland, The Doomsday Device. Our podcast artwork is provided by J.P. Tanner. Find his other work at tanwoodcreative.com. This podcast is distributed by WDW News Today, the worldwide leader in Disney Parks news. Read all they have to offer at wdwnt.com. Dreamfinders is hosted and produced by yours truly, Nathan Hartman, who you can follow on Twitter at SomeStuffISaid. Also, if you or someone else you know would make a great guest on this program, feel free to email us at dreamfinders@wdwnt.com. I'm Nathan Hartman, and remember, if we can dream it, then we can do it.